Hey everyone. So I have been asked to talk about my process for preparing for my TEDx talk that I did in Kitchener in the fall of 2017. It was called Reclaiming Space. In terms of the writing process, we had to apply for the talk and we had to give an outline of the type of talk that we were going to give. So I knew that I wanted to talk about fat and body shaming as a site of discrimination and marginalization, and specifically in schools. So I knew I wanted to talk about my own experience, which I do in my blog writing as well. I always make the ideas that I have connected to a personal story. But what ended up happening, I guess, was that through the writing process and through the help of the mentor that I was given through TEDx Kitchener, I was able to refine what I was doing. So I started with a general idea. I knew that I wanted to connect to Brene Brown's work. She's a researcher that I love, and she talks a lot about fear and shame, as well as vulnerability, which all speaks very strongly to me. We had to create a bio as well, and that actually took me longer than you would think. I created 6 different ones. I wanted to make sure that it was playful, because writing a bio, sometimes I have to write them in a really professional environment, but I felt that with a TED Talk that it needed to be a little more playful. I also took a course through an organization called IDOU, which is a design firm, and the course was called Storytelling for Influence. And I read a few books. One of them in particular was by a woman named Nancy Duarte, who also has a TED Talk called The Secret Structure of Great Talk. So I watched that, and I read a couple of her books on how do you create a strong presentation. So how did I consider, another question I was asked to speak to was, how did I consider an audience when I was preparing for a verbal text? And the interesting thing was, I figured it would be a lot of educators. What I didn't know was that of the 2,000 people who ended up being there, 1,200 of them were high school students. And this was actually a huge advantage for me, I felt, but I didn't write it knowing that. So it ended up, I think, really speaking to the students in the audience, and that brought so much energy to the actual evening. And I think that also some other people that presented that night, they were very focused on educational ideas, but I think it might have spoken more to educators rather than students. And so I think I had actually an advantage there. Not that it was a competition, but I think that that's why the students really reacted, because this differed in some way from what some of the other talks were about. In terms of preparing also, I had to memorize my talk, and memorization is not something that comes easily to me. I actually read about that too, the best way to memorize, and I read a lot of things that said that your brain holds on to information better when you've linked it through physical activity. So I work out a lot, and during my spin classes I would practice saying it. When I swam, I would say it in my head if I was on my front, and I'd say it out loud on my back. I had a few mouthfuls of water doing that. And I also practiced with my family, in particular with my daughter, who I think knew the talk off by heart by the time I was done as well. And then thinking about how the skills of writing and speaking are interconnected, I believe that I write how I speak. Obviously, when you write, you can refine it, and I've already jumbled my words a few times just speaking in this little video. But I really feel that the whole point of communication is to be understood and heard. So although I can read high-level academic texts, I have a doctorate, I've written a thesis, I feel that speaking in a way that people can understand is the whole point of communication. And when you speak from the heart or write from the heart, it connects to people and it connects to their own stories. Something else I would also say is that, and I actually think I learned this from Jay-Z. It was on Masterclass, where he talked about he learned far more from his failures than his successes, and that his first album that was very successful, he tried to replicate it because he wanted to appease the audience. And ultimately, what he learned was that he had to do it for himself, that the art is about your own self-expression. And so I write for myself, and not just for myself as audience, but for myself as a reflective tool, and being very honest, open, and vulnerable. And then I hope that in that way it will speak to others. Some of the things that I enjoyed about the experience and things that I also found challenging is another question that I was asked to respond to. So one of the things, as I mentioned earlier, was the fact that there were 1,200 high school kids in the audience. That just changed the energy of the whole evening, and I absolutely loved it. I was the last one to speak before the break, the second break, and so when I walked out, I was literally swarmed by like hundreds of high school kids. And then my daughter told me after that somebody came up to her and said, "Is that Debbie Donsky?" And she said, "Yeah, that's my mom." And I had spoken about Rach in my talk. And so the person that asked her said, "Oh my God, you're Rachie?" And she started screaming and hugging her. And my daughter is not one who gives hugs to just anyone, so it was a little overwhelming, but it made me laugh really hard. I would say one of the things that was challenging was, and Brene Brown talks about this too, that being vulnerable isn't about oversharing. It's about, feeling that the stories you're about to tell are, the audience deserves to hear them. And I had to practice a lot to say that talk, because as I wrote it and as I spoke it, and practiced over and over and over again, I often would cry through the stories. And it's amazing because the big story in there was about grade 8 gym class, and I'm 49 years old. That was a long time ago, and I've since become very, very active. I would say since my mid-20s, I've been very active. Still fat, but very active. And I didn't realize how much I was still holding on to it. So that was a really exhausting part of preparing it, but I think that's what happens when you write from that place. And I have one more note. So it's funny. Right before I went out, there was a guy that went up there, and he apparently is a professional musician. And I was so nervous to go out, because I thought I'm never going to do as well as everybody else. There was a lot of self-doubt right before I went out. And I listened to him, and the audience was cheering, and they were totally into what he did. And I thought, oh God, how can I follow somebody like that? And at that moment, he came off stage and he said, "Well, I winged that one." And I thought, I got this. I had literally practiced for months. I did research. I took a course. I had memorized it. I knew that, as good as he was, and he was a natural. That's what he did for a living, was to be on stage and entertain. I knew that by practicing and refining and working with my mentor, that I had something that was worthwhile to share. And when at the very beginning of the talk, you would hear me say, "Oh, I'm so glad I didn't fall." So anyone, I'm so glad I didn't trip, or something like that. Anyone who knows me would think it was because I had to walk downstairs, and I sometimes get dizzy when I walk downstairs, but it was because I was so nervous that my legs felt like jello, and I didn't think I could stand on my own 2 feet. But once the audience clapped, it just took away all the nerves, and it was a fantastic evening. So I highly recommend that you go forth despite your fears, and hope this video helped. Okay, thanks.